I have sold our house. I cannot give you that money, mother. That evening, the scent of apple pie filled the dining room, but the air was heavy with unspoken tension. Julian was fiddling with his fork, boasting about how his next big venture would finally make him a millionaire. Clara sat in silence, her head bowed, unable to even curl her fingers around her spoon due to the years of labor. Martha glared at her daughter-in-law, pressuring her by saying a sister-in-law should always help family. Suddenly, Henry reached into his jacket pocket and placed two documents in the center of the table. One was a record of Julian's staggering debts, and the other was a signed contract to sell the house. Martha's face turned deathly pale, and Julian's smug smile vanished instantly. Clara held her breath, staring at her husband in disbelief as Henry slowly began to speak. What led Henry to make such a drastic decision? What dark secrets had been hidden within this family for 25 years? Thank you for visiting our channel for these heartfelt stories. Before we begin, please subscribe and like this video, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can send our warmest wishes to you. Now let us begin today's story. Thought the damp, salt-kissed fog of Providence rolled off the Narragansett Bay, weaving through the skeletal elm trees and settling heavily upon the cobblestones of Benefit Street. It was the kind of evening where the air felt thick enough to swallow the light, casting the historic colonial homes into gray, ghostly silhouettes. Inside the Miller residence, a drafty Victorian that had seen better days, the warmth of the kitchen was a deceptive sanctuary. The scent of a freshly baked apple pie, sweet, cinnamon-spiced, and buttery, filled the room, a fragrant mask for the rot of a 25-year-old resentment that was finally reaching its breaking point. Clara Miller stood by the stove, her frame slight and perpetually hunched as if bracing for a blow that never quite landed. She was a woman of 62 who looked 70, her face a map of quiet endurance and faded dreams. As she moved to set the table, she instinctively tucked her hands beneath the rough fabric of her floral apron. Those hands, once capable of coaxing nocturnes from a grand piano, were now a cartography of pain. The knuckles were swollen and angry, the skin etched with deep red fissures from a quarter-century of scalding steam and harsh detergents at the Blue Mist Laundry. Across from her sat Martha Miller, Henry's mother. Martha was a woman carved from granite in old-fashioned entitlement, her silver hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her eyes into a permanent glare. She sat regally at the head of the oak table, her presence commanding the air out of the room. Beside her was Julian, Henry's younger brother. At 45, Julian still possessed the boyish, hollow charm of a man who had never had to pay for his own mistakes. His expensive silk shirt, likely bought with money he didn't earn, looked out of place against the peeling wallpaper of the dining room. "It's a simple request, Henry," Martha said, her voice cutting through the clinking of silverware like a rusted blade. "Julian has a vision this time, a real estate venture in Newport. All he needs is a bridge loan, $50,000. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what you make at the academy." Henry Miller, a man of quiet dignity with graying temples and eyes that usually held the patience of a saint, didn't look up from his plate. He was a high school history teacher, a man who believed in the weight of the past but was currently drowning in the present. He looked at Clara, seeing the way she winced as she tried to grip the water pitcher. "Mother," Henry said softly, his voice trembling with a restraint that felt like a fraying rope. "Julian has had 12 visions in the last decade. Restaurants that never opened, tech firms that didn't have a product, and that boutique hotel that turned out to be a gambling debt." "That was bad luck, Henry. You know that," Julian interjected, flashing a practiced, defensive smile. "This is different. This is Newport. If you believe God still performs miracles, this story will restore your faith. I just need one more push. For the family name." Martha slammed her hand on the table, making the pie tin rattle. "Clara, tell your husband not to be so selfish. You've always been the sensible one. You know we look after our own." Clara didn't look up. She felt the familiar, cold dread pooling in her stomach. "Henry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the old refrigerator. "Maybe we can find a way. If it makes things quiet." She was a woman who had bought peace with her own blood and bone for so long, she no longer knew how to value herself. She was ready to accept this as her unchangeable fate. Henry's eyes snapped to his wife's hands. He saw a bead of blood blooming from a crack on her thumb as she squeezed the fabric of her apron. Something in him, a bridge built on decades of silence, finally collapsed. Quiet? Henry asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. You want quiet, Mother? I'll give you the truth instead. It's much louder. He reached into the inner pocket of his tweed jacket and pulled out 2 sets of documents bound with heavy clips. He placed them on the table with a thud that seemed to echo through the entire house. The first, Henry said, sliding a paper toward Julian, is a comprehensive record of the debt I've discovered. $150,000. That is the total of the loans Julian has extracted from Clara's secret savings over the last 25 years. Money she earned at the laundry while we were all sleeping. Money meant for her surgery. Money he gambled away. Julian's face went white. Martha's mouth opened, but no sound came out. And the second, Henry continued, his voice rising, is a signed contract with a realtor. This house is sold. The closing is in 30 days. You did what? Martha shrieked, her face turning a mottled purple. This is the Miller house. You can't sell my home. It hasn't been a home for a long time, Mother. It's been a tomb, Henry said. He stood up slowly, his height suddenly imposing. Clara looked at him in total shock, her breath hitching in her chest. Henry, no! Clara stammered, her heart racing. Henry, yes, he roared. In a sudden, violent motion of catharsis, he swept his arm across the table. The plates, the silverware, and the untouched apple pie flew across the room, crashing against the wall and shattering on the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the small kitchen. Martha and Julian recoiled in horror. Clara stood frozen, her cracked hands pressed to her mouth. Look at her! Henry pointed a shaking finger at Clara. Look at her hands, Julian. Do you see the red? Do you see the scars? She hasn't spoken a word of complaint in months, until one word today changed everything for me. Solace? She was looking for solace, and all you gave her was more weight to carry. He stepped toward his mother, his eyes burning with a fire she had never seen. You think she should help him? You think she should give more? She thought she could silence the truth by suffering in the dark, but I've uncovered the evidence, and I won't let her drown for a son who refuses to swim. This house isn't yours to give away, Martha hissed, though her voice lacked its usual venom. This house, Henry said, leaning down so he was eye to eye with her, is no longer a monument to the Miller name. It is a debt that has been paid in full by the woman you treated like a servant. This house doesn't belong to the Miller bloodline anymore. It belongs to the hands that were ruined to keep it standing. And since those hands can no longer work, I am turning this wooden brick into the freedom she deserves. He turned to Clara, his expression softening into a look of profound, agonizing love. He reached out and gently took her hands, pulling them from her apron despite her attempt to hide them. He kissed the scarred knuckles, his tears falling onto her skin. We are leaving, Clara, he whispered. We are going to Boston. We are going to find a doctor, and we are never coming back to this fog. Clara looked at her husband, then at the shattered remains of the dinner on the floor, and finally at the 2 people who had spent decades consuming her life. For the first time in 25 years, the invisible chains felt light. Julian sat in stunned silence, the paper in front of him a death warrant for his lifestyle. Martha sat frozen, the queen of a castle that had just turned to dust. Henry didn't wait for a reply. He led Clara out of the kitchen, leaving the scent of cinnamon and the sound of silence behind them. Outside, the fog was still thick, but for Henry and Clara, the air had never felt clearer. The morning after the dinner, the Providence fog had surrendered to a relentless, biting drizzle that soaked through wool coats and chilled the bone. Henry didn't go to the academy. He couldn't. His mind was a storm of the documents he had unearthed, and the ghost of the apple pie splattered against the wall. Instead, he drove toward the industrial edge of the city, a place of red brick warehouses and low-hanging power lines, until he saw the flickering neon sign, Blue Mist Laundry. He parked across the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel. For 25 years, this place had been the silent backdrop of their lives. The reason Clara's hair always smelled faintly of bleach. The reason she was always the first to wake and the last to sleep. He realized with a jolt of shame that he had rarely stepped inside. It was Clara's world, a world he had allowed her to occupy alone because it was easier than asking how much it hurt. Henry stepped out of the car and pushed through the heavy glass door. The heat hit him like a physical blow. It was an oppressive, humid wall of air, saturated with the cloying scent of industrial starch and the metallic tang of overheated steam. The roar of the massive, drum-like washing machines made the floorboards vibrate beneath his feet. Through a thick veil of swirling white vapor, he saw her. Clara was standing behind a long, stainless steel pressing station. She looked impossibly small against the backdrop of the towering machines. She was wrestling with a mountain of heavy linens, thick, white tablecloths from the upscale restaurants on Federal Hill. Her movements were jerky, labored. She had to use her entire body weight to pull down the heavy arm of the industrial press, her feet slipping slightly on the wet floor tiles. Henry stood frozen near the entrance, hidden by a stack of plastic-wrapped uniforms. He watched her for a long time, and as he watched, the present began to blur into a painful, sharp-edged memory. 25 years ago, in a sun-drenched apartment near Brown University, those same hands had been light. He remembered Clara sitting at her mahogany upright piano, her fingers dancing across the keys with the grace of a bird in flight. She had been a rising star at the conservatory, her music full of hope and a lyrical, mythological quality that made Henry feel as though he were living in a timeless tale. But then Julian's first disaster had struck, a failed investment that threatened Martha's home and his own future. Clara had closed the piano lid that night and never truly opened it again. She had traded the ivory keys for the silver handles of the blue mist, telling Henry it was just, for a little while, to help the family. That little while had become a life sentence. "Morning, Henry. You lost?" Henry jumped. Standing beside him was Silas, a man who looked like he had been forged from iron and ash. Silas was the owner of the Blue Mist, a man in his late 60s with a permanent scowl and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. Despite his gruff exterior, he was the only person who saw Clara's daily struggle. I came to see her," Henry managed to say. Silas grunted, crossing his massive arms. "She's been here since 5. One of the boilers is acting up, so the heat's worse than usual today. I told her to take a break, but you know your wife. She says she's got obligations. Though why a woman with hands like hers is still pushing a press, I'll never know." "What do you mean, Silas?" Silas looked at Henry with a mixture of pity and irritation. "Look at the way she's holding that handle, Henry. She can't even close her fist anymore. She's been working through a flare-up for 3 weeks. I've seen her icing them in the break room with frozen peas just to get through the afternoon shift." Henry felt a wave of nausea. He looked back at Clara. She was currently reaching for a fresh load of wet laundry. As she lifted the heavy bin, he saw her face contort. Her knuckles were stark white against her beet-red, scalded skin. The chemicals in the air seemed to be thickening, turning the vapor into a choking fog. At that moment, a new figure emerged from the back office. Vera, a younger woman with tired eyes and a sharp tongue who worked the intake counter. Vera was the neighborhood gossip, but she held a fierce, protective streak for Clara. "Henry Miller, about time you showed your face here," Vera shouted over the noise of the dryers. "Maybe you can convince her to stop. She's been swaying like a leaf in the wind all morning. We tried to give her water, but she just keeps saying she needs the overtime." Henry started to walk toward Clara, but he was stopped by a sudden, terrifying change in the rhythm of the room. Clara had reached for the steam lever, but her hand didn't quite make it. She missed the handle, her fingers sliding uselessly off the metal. Her knees buckled. "Clara!" Henry screamed. He bolted toward the station, dodging a moving cart of linens. Clara collapsed slowly, like a marionette with its strings cut. She hit the floor just as a jet of stray steam hissed from a nearby pipe, shrouding her in a white cloud. Henry slid onto the wet tiles, scooping her into his arms. Her skin was burning to the touch, not from a fever, but from the relentless heat of the shop. He looked down at her hands, which were now resting limp against his chest. They were terrifyingly red, the skin stretched tight over the swollen joints, smelling of lye and hot metal. Her eyes fluttered, partially opening, though they remained glazed and unfocused. She didn't seem to see him, or perhaps she saw him through the lens of 25 years ago. "Henry?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I'm here, Clara. I've got you. We're leaving." She tried to push him away feebly, her mind still trapped in the cycle of sacrifice. Her lips moved, forming words that broke Henry's heart more than any scream could have. "Don't, don't tell Mother," she mambled, her head lolling against his shoulder. "Don't tell her I'm tired. Julian. Julian needs the money for his shop. I can finish the tablecloths." "No more, Clara. No more," Henry sobbed, pulling her closer. Silas and Vera hovered nearby, Silas already on his phone calling for an ambulance. The other workers had stopped their machines, and for the first time in decades, the blue mist grew quiet. In that silence, the only sound was the drip of condensation from the ceiling and Henry's ragged breathing. He looked around at the rusted machines, the stained walls, and the piles of other people's clothes. This was the temple where his wife had been sacrificed, bit by bit, for a brother who was a ghost and a mother who was a tyrant. He felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over him. He lifted her entirely, her small frame feeling weightless in his arms. He didn't wait for the ambulance. He carried her past Silas, past the intake counter, and out into the cold, gray drizzle of Providence. The rain hit their faces, a shocking contrast to the suffocating heat of the laundry. Clara shivered, her eyes closing again, her red, damaged hands finally still. As he tucked her into the car, Henry looked back at the blue mist one last time. He wasn't just taking his wife home. He was declaring a final, irreversible war on the life they had lived. The house felt like a hollow rib cage, creaking under the weight of a silence that was far more deafening than the screaming match of the previous night. Clara was upstairs, finally drifting into a heavy, medicinal sleep in their bedroom. Henry had watched the doctor examine her, a kind man named Dr. Aries who had looked at Clara's hands and then at Henry with a silent, devastating judgment that said more than any medical report ever could. "She needs absolute rest, Henry," Dr. Aries had said, his voice grave. "But more than that, she needs to stop whatever has been eroding her. Bodies don't break like this by accident." Unable to sit still, Henry found himself drawn to the basement. It was a place he usually avoided. A damp, low-ceilinged cavern filled with the ghosts of Martha's furniture and Julian's discarded projects. He told himself he was looking for the old humidifier to help Clara's breathing, but as he moved through the shadows of the Providence Victorian, he felt a strange magnetic pull toward the far corner, behind the rusted furnace. There, tucked beneath a stack of moth-eaten moving blankets, sat a small cedar box. It was weathered, its brass latch tarnished to a dull brown, but it was clean, as if someone had spent years lovingly wiping the dust from its surface while the rest of the world rotted around it. Henry knelt on the cold concrete, his heart hammered against his ribs. He knew, with a sudden and terrifying certainty, that he was trespassing on the only part of Clara that she hadn't given away. He hesitated, his thumb brushing the latch. Then, thinking of her red, ruined hands, he flicked it open. He expected jewelry, perhaps a memento from her days at the conservatory. Instead, the box was a reliquary of pain. At the very top lay a stack of pharmacy receipts. Henry flipped through them, his brow furrowed. They were for high-dose ibuprofen, topical lidocaine, and industrial-strength paraffin wax. The dates spanned a decade. Clara hadn't just been suffering. She had been self-medicating in secret, spending her meager pocket money just to keep her hands moving well enough to earn more money for Julian. Beneath the receipts lay a small, leather-bound ledger. On the cover, in Clara's elegant, slanted handwriting, were the words, "The Boston Dream." Henry opened it, his eyes blurred as he realized it was a savings passbook. For 25 years, Clara had been siphoning pennies from her grueling shifts at the Blue Mist. $5 here, $10 there. The balance had once climbed to nearly $12,000, the exact amount needed for a specialized reconstructive surgery in Boston that promised to restore the mobility in her joints. But the ledger told a secondary, darker story. Red ink slashed through the deposits. July 14th, withdrawn $2,000. Julian's emergency back taxes. November 3rd, withdrawn $1,500. Martha's roof repair. Julian lost the insurance money. The most recent entries were the most frequent and the most devastating. Henry turned the page and found a series of loose diary entries tucked into the back of the book. October 12th. The script was shaky, the letters jagged as if written with a hand that couldn't quite grip the pen. Julian lost again at the underground tables. He came to the laundry crying. He said they would break his legs. I gave him the money I saved for the winter clinic. My knuckles are hot tonight. I can't play the piano in my head anymore. The music is getting quiet. Henry let out a choked sound, a mix of a sob and a snarl. He had been a history teacher for 30 years, teaching about the rise and fall of empires. And all the while, he had missed the slow, agonizing collapse of the woman he loved. He dug deeper into the box and found a folded piece of parchment. It was a formal surgical quote from a clinic in Boston, dated 2 years ago. The price was $8,000. Stapled to it was a bank withdrawal slip for exactly that amount. But the date on the withdrawal slip was what froze the blood in Henry's veins. December 24th, last year. Memory surged back like a tidal wave. Last Christmas Eve, the house had been filled with the forced cheer Martha insisted upon. Julian had arrived late, looking haggard, claiming he had been mugged. Martha had taken Clara into the kitchen for a long, whispered conversation. Later that night, Martha had miraculously produced the funds to help Julian get back on his feet, claiming she had found some old bonds. Henry stared at the papers in the dim basement light. He realized with a sickening jolt that Martha hadn't found bonds. She had waited for Clara to go to sleep, or perhaps she had pressured her into a corner she couldn't escape, and had taken the very money meant to save Clara's hands to pay off Julian's gambling debts. Clara had spent Christmas morning smiling through her pain, her hands so swollen she couldn't even unwrap her own gifts, while the money that could have healed her was being handed over to a bookie. You knew, Henry whispered into the dark. You knew she was dying by inches, and you took the last of her life to feed him. As he sat there, a new presence entered the basement. Mrs. Gable, their longtime neighbor from 3 houses down, stood at the top of the stairs. Mrs. Gable was a widow of 70, a woman who saw everything through her lace curtains and carried a heavy iron skillet as both a tool and a warning. She had brought over a pot of soup after seeing the doctor's car earlier. "Henry, are you down there?" she called softly. She descended the stairs, her eyes landing on the box in his lap. She didn't look surprised. "She used to come over to my porch sometimes, Henry," Mrs. Gable said, her voice filled with a weary sadness. "When the pain got too bad to hide from you, she'd sit there and soak those hands in Epsom salts while I made her tea. She told me once that the hardest part wasn't the work. It was the hope being stolen." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Henry asked, his voice cracking. Mrs. Gable walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because she loved you enough to let you believe you were a good man in a happy home. And because Martha Miller is a woman who knows how to make a person feel like a villain for asking for the truth." Henry looked at the Jacmo Boston ledger one last time. The balance was now 0. Every cent of Clara's 25-year sacrifice had been drained by the Miller family greed. He stood up, the box clutched to his chest. He wasn't the quiet history teacher anymore. The man who had walked down these stairs was gone. In his place was a man who saw his path with terrifying clarity. He climbed the stairs past Mrs. Gable and walked straight to the hall telephone. He didn't call the academy. He didn't call the realtor. He called a number he had seen on one of the legal documents Julian had dropped. "Julian," Henry said when the phone picked up. His voice was as cold as the Providence winter. "I found the box. I found the ledger. If you or Mother are not out of this city by the end of the month, I won't just sell the house. I will hand this ledger to the district attorney and tell them exactly how you raised your capital." He hung up before the stuttering excuse could begin. He walked back to the bedroom where Clara was sleeping, her bandaged hands resting on the quilt. He sat beside her and waited for the sun to rise over the Rhode Island coast, knowing that the Boston dream wasn't dead. He would bring it back, even if he had to burn everything else to the ground to do it. The Providence sky had turned a bruised, sickly purple by late afternoon, as if the heavens themselves were reflecting the swelling inflammation in Clara's joints. Then the clouds finally broke. A cold, lashing rain began to hammer against the Victorian windows, turning the historic streets into a blurred watercolor of gray and slate. Inside the house, the atmosphere was even more turbulent. Henry had stepped out to the local pharmacy to fulfill the new prescriptions Dr. Eris had ordered. He had left Clara resting on the sofa, her hands wrapped in warm compresses. But the peace was short-lived. The heavy brass knocker on the front door began to strike with a rhythmic, violent urgency that sounded like an executioner's drum. Clara, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird, struggled to her feet. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. By the time she reached the foyer, the door had already burst open. Martha Miller surged in, her umbrella dripping icy water onto the hardwood floor like a trail of venom. Behind her skulked Julian, his collar turned up, his eyes darting around the house as if calculating the scrap value of the furniture. "Where is he?" Martha hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying cold fury. "Where is my son, Clara? Where is the man you've poisoned with your lies?" Clara retreated into the living room, her bandaged hands held instinctively against her chest. "Henry is at the pharmacy, Mother Miller. He'll be back soon. Please sit down, you're soaked." "Don't you mother me!" Martha shrieked, stepping into the center of the room. "I know what you did. You whispered in his ear, didn't you? You told him you were tired. You showed him your little wounds, all to trick him into selling my family's legacy. You want to take this house, the house where my husband breathed his last, and turn it into cash for your own selfish whims." Julian stepped forward, playing the role of the aggrieved victim. "Clara, how could you? I was so close to that Newport deal. If Henry sells this place, I lose everything. Do you really want to be the reason your own family ends up on the street?" "I never asked him to sell," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. I only wanted to stop hurting." "Liars always say that," Martha snapped. She reached into her leather handbag and pulled out a legal-sized document. "If you have a shred of decency left, you'll fix this." Julian had his lawyer draw this up this morning. It's a formal renunciation of any claim to the Miller estate and a statement that you coerced Henry into the sale while he was under emotional duress. Sign it. Sign it, and maybe I'll let you stay in the guest house when Julian buys it back." Clara looked at the paper. The words blurred before her eyes. The 25 years of GD techniques, the guilt, the manipulation, the silent voice of her own self-worth, bore down on her like the crushing weight of a landslide. She felt the justice and redemption hook pull at her soul. She wanted peace, even if it was a false one bought with her own total erasure. "If I sign this," Clara mumbled, her spirit breaking, "will the fighting stop? Will Julian be okay?" "Yes, Clara," Julian said, his voice dropping into a smooth, oily tone. "Everything will go back to the way it was. You'll be taken care of. Just sign." He handed her a heavy fountain pen. Clara's fingers, swollen and stiff, could barely wrap around the barrel. She moved toward the coffee table, her hand trembling so violently the pen scratched aimlessly at the air. Outside, the rain intensified, drenching a figure standing on the sidewalk. Officer Miller, no relation, but a longtime neighborhood patrolman, had paused his cruiser when he saw Martha's aggressive entry. Officer Miller was a burly man with a salt and pepper mustache and a reputation for knowing exactly whose dog was barking and whose marriage was fraying. He stood by the gate, his hand on his radio, debating whether to intervene in what looked like a domestic assault. He was about to call for backup when a familiar dark sedan tore around the corner, hydroplaning slightly before slamming to a halt. Henry Miller didn't wait to turn off the headlights. He vaulted from the car, his eyes fixed on the shadows moving behind his living room curtains. Inside, Clara had just touched the nib of the pen to the signature line. "Don't you dare!" The front door didn't just open. It crashed against the stopper with a force that rattled the chandelier. Henry stood in the doorway, drenched, his breath coming in jagged heaves. He looked like a man possessed, a mythological hero returning to find his hearth defiled. "Henry!" Martha cried, trying to regain her composure. "Thank God you're here." Clara was just about to do the right thing. Henry didn't say a word. He strode across the room, the water from his coat spraying the rug. He snatched the document from the table before Clara's trembling hand could leave a mark. He looked at the legal jargon, the coercion clauses, the renunciation of a woman who had given her marrow to this family. His eyes were no longer those of a weary teacher. They were filled with a red fire and absolute incandescent clarity. "Henry, please," Julian started. It's just a formality to protect the rip. The sound of the thick parchment tearing was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. Henry didn't just tear it once. He shredded it into a dozen pieces, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. He threw the scraps into the air, letting them flutter down like gray snow onto Julian's expensive shoes. "From this second," Henry said, his voice low and vibrating with a power that made Martha step back, "Clara is no longer a miller. She is not a bank. She is not a servant. And she is certainly not a slave to the hollow, pathetic failures of a man who hasn't worked a day in his life." He turned to his mother. "You came into my home to bully a woman who can't even hold a pen because she was too busy paying for your son's sins. You want to talk about motherhood? A mother protects. You're a predator." "How dare you?" Martha gasped. "I'll tell you what I'm daring," Henry roared, stepping toward Julian. "I didn't just find the cedar box, Julian. I found the bank records. I found the forged signatures you used on Clara's accounts 3 years ago when she was too sick to go to the bank herself. That isn't family business. That is felony fraud." Julian's face went from pale to a ghostly translucent white. "I have already spoken to a colleague at the district attorney's office," Henry continued, his eyes locked on his brother. "The house is sold. The money is going into a trust for Clara's surgery and our future. If you or mother ever set foot on this property again, or so much as whisper Clara's name, I will hand over the ledger, the forged slips, and the pharmacy records to the police. I will see you in a jumpsuit, Julian. I swear it on the life you stole from her." Martha looked at her son, then at the shredded paper on the floor. For the first time in her life, she saw that the silent voice she had suppressed had found its champion. She saw that the unlikely hero wasn't her favored son, but the one she had underestimated. "Julian," Martha whispered, her voice finally breaking, "we're leaving." She didn't look at Clara. She didn't look at Henry. She grabbed Julian's arm and dragged him toward the door. As they stepped out into the pouring rain, they passed Officer Miller, who was still standing by the gate. He gave Henry a sharp, knowing nod before returning to his cruiser. The house grew quiet, save for the rhythm of the rain on the roof. Henry turned to Clara. She was still sitting on the sofa, her face buried in her bandaged hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, heaving sobs. Henry knelt before her, just as he had in the basement. He didn't say anything at first. He simply took her wrists, carefully so as not to hurt her, and pulled her hands away from her face. "It's over, Clara," he whispered. "The war is over." Clara looked at him, her eyes red and streaming with tears. "You say it," she breathed. "You really say it." "I should have done it 20 years ago," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled her into his arms, holding her, as the Providence storm raged outside, knowing that for the first time in a quarter-century, the air inside was finally clean. The drive from Providence to the outskirts of Boston was a quiet migration of souls. As the skyline of Rhode Island faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the rolling emerald hills of Massachusetts, Henry felt a literal weight lifting from the chassis of the car. They were no longer the Millers of Benefit Street. They were two people fleeing a ghost story. Henry had rented a small, shingled cottage in a quiet town called Brookline, a place where the air smelled of salt marshes and ancient oak trees, far removed from the sulfurous steam of the Blue Mist Laundry. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting on a velvet pillow Henry had bought for the journey. She stared out at the passing trees with wide, unblinking eyes. For 25 years, her world had been 3 rooms and a basement, or the humid cage of the laundry. The vastness of the open road seemed to frighten her. Every time they passed a sign for a dry cleaner or a tailor, her fingers would twitch instinctively, searching for the phantom weight of a heavy iron. "It's too quiet, Henry," she whispered as they pulled into the driveway of the cottage. The house was surrounded by a wild garden of hydrangeas and lavender. "I feel like I should be doing something. The tablecloths, Julian's taxes. The only thing you are doing today, Clara, is breathing," Henry said firmly, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "The world won't stop spinning because you rested, I promise." The first 2 weeks were the hardest. Henry had immediately made appointments with the best specialists in Boston. But before the physical healing could begin, he had to address the fracture in Clara's spirit. He introduced her to Dr. Evelyn Vance, a gentle woman with silver hair and a voice like a warm cello. Dr. Vance was a therapist specializing in recovery from long-term emotional suppression. Clara believes her value is tied to her output, Dr. Vance told Henry privately during the first week. She has been a machine for so long that she has forgotten how to be a person. If she isn't working, she feels like she is disappearing. Clara's panic was a silent, vibrating thing. She would wake up at 5 a.m., her heart racing, wandering the cottage looking for something to scrub, something to fold. When Henry led her back to bed, she would weep, her bandaged hands trembling. "I'm a burden, Henry. I'm just a broken thing you're carrying." Henry didn't argue. He simply practiced the transformation hook, the journey from pain to happiness. Every night, after the sun dipped below the trees, he would sit her in a comfortable armchair by the fireplace. He would take her hands, still wrapped in soft white gauze after the preliminary injections, and hold them with a reverence that made her flinch at first. Then he would read to her. Not the history books he taught from, but the lyrical, mythological poetry they had loved when they were young. He read her the tales of Orpheus, of souls being led out of the dark. He read her poems about the sea and the resilience of the earth. "Your hands aren't just for working, Clara," he whispered one night as the fire crackled. "They were meant to feel the world. They were meant to hold mine." Soon the day of the surgery arrived. Henry had used the deposit from the house sale to secure a place at the Boston Hand and Orthopedic Institute. Clara was terrified. As they wheeled her toward the operating room, she grabbed Henry's sleeve with a strength he didn't know she still had. "What if they can't fix them?" she asked, her voice small. "What if I'm just a ghost of who I was?" "Then I will love a ghost," Henry replied. The surgeon, Dr. Julian Thorne, a man whose name Henry found ironically bitter, but whose skill was legendary, spent 4 hours meticulously cleaning the scar tissue and realigning the ravaged joints. He described the process to Henry as reclaiming a lost territory. The recovery at the cottage was slow. Clara's hands were encased in heavy casts, then lighter splints. She was forced into a state of total stillness. Henry became her hands. He brushed her hair. He fed her. He turned the pages of her books. He saw her frustration, the way she looked at the kitchen with a desperate urge to be useful. But he also saw the silent voice beginning to change. The tension in her shoulders began to dissipate. She started to notice the birds in the garden. She started to hum melodies she hadn't thought of since the conservatory. The climax of their first month in Brookline came on a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of early spring. Dr. Thorne had come to the cottage to perform the final removal of the surgical dressings. Clara sat in the garden, the sunlight dappling through the oak leaves. Henry stood behind her, his breath held in his chest. Dr. Thorne worked with a steady, clinical grace, unwinding the layers of white gauze. One by one, the layers fell away, like the skin of a chrysalis. When the last wrap was removed, Clara didn't look. She kept her eyes shut tight. "Open them, Clara," Henry urged softly. She opened her eyes and looked down at her lap. Her hands were thin, and there were faint, silvery scars tracing the lines of the incisions. The knuckles were no longer angry and swollen. The fingers, though still stiff, lay straight and graceful. They looked like her hands again, the hands of the girl who had once played Chopin in the moonlight. Henry reached into a nearby bush and clipped a single pale pink rose. It was heavy with dew, its stem thick with tiny thorns. He held it out to her. Clara's breath hitched. She reached out, her movements slow and deliberate. For 25 years, she had gripped things with a claw-like desperation, bracing for the jolt of pain that always followed. But as her thumb and forefinger closed around the stem, there was nothing. No fire, no sharp electric agony. She held the rose. She felt the velvet texture of the petals, the coolness of the dew, the slight prickle of the stem. She moved her fingers, a tiny tentative flexing of the joints. A single tear tracked down her cheek, followed by a silent deluge. She looked up at Henry, her face radiant with a miracle hook. The restoration of faith. "I can feel it," she sobbed, her voice ringing out in the quiet garden. "I can feel the rose, Henry. I'm not a machine anymore. I'm not an instrument for Julian. I feel like a real person, Henry. For the first time, I am actually here." Henry fell to his mow, burying his face in her lap, his own tears soaking her skirt. The justice and redemption hook had finally come full circle. The good were being rewarded, and the wicked were far, far away. Clara's hands, once a symbol of her enslavement, were now the banners of her freedom. In the quiet suburb of Boston, the woman who had been a ghost was finally coming home to herself. The golden leaves of a Brookline autumn were beginning to drift past the cottage windows when the past finally caught up with the wreckage it had created. Henry was in the small kitchen, carefully preparing a ginger tea for Clara, when his phone vibrated against the granite counter. It was a call from Providence. Not from the house on Benefit Street, but from the office of a Detective Vance, a man with a voice like gravel and the directness of a sledgehammer. Julian had been arrested. It wasn't just the gambling debts this time. In his desperate scramble to cover his tracks, he had attempted to forge a series of property deeds in Newport, hoping to flip land he didn't own. The vision he had pitched at that fateful dinner had been a house of cards built on criminal desperation. He tried to pin it on his mother, Detective Vance informed Henry. He claimed the old woman was the one who signed the documents. When that didn't work, he turned on her. The landlord says he threw her out of the small apartment they were renting. He left her on the sidewalk with a single suitcase. Henry hung up the phone, his face a mask of cold, hard stone. He felt a surge of justice and redemption. The wicked were finally facing the punishment they had so long evaded. Julian was behind bars, and Martha Miller, the woman who had ruled her kingdom with a rod of iron, was now a peasant in the ruins. "Let her stay there," Henry whispered to the empty kitchen. "Let her feel the cold she forced on Clara for 25 years. He had every intention of letting the silence of Providence swallow his mother. He had warned them. He had drawn the line in the rain. But when he walked into the living room to share the news, he found Clara sitting by the window, her hands, now nimble enough to hold a knitting needle, resting in her lap. She had heard the conversation. "She has no one, Henry," Clara said softly. Her voice lacked the tremor of fear it once held. It was grounded now, reflective of the silent voice that had found its strength. "She has Julian," Henry snapped. "The son she chose. The son she stole your surgery money to save. Julian is gone, Henry, and Martha is 75 years old. She is a woman who believed God still performs miracles, but she was looking for them in the wrong child," Clara replied, her eyes distant, reflecting a call to faith that transcended bitterness. Henry stared at his wife. He looked at the faint, silvery scars on her knuckles, the marks of a transformation that had cost her everything. "Clara, after what she did, after the blue mist, after the cedar box, how can you even suggest we help her? Because if we leave her on that sidewalk, Henry, then we are the people they wanted us to be," Clara said, rising from her chair with a new quiet grace. "I don't want their money. I don't want this house's ghost. But I won't have her blood on my hands, not now that these hands can finally feel again." It was Clara who led the way. She insisted they use a portion of the remaining funds from the sale of their Providence home to secure a place for Martha. They found the Willows, an upscale assisted living community in the quiet woods of Rhode Island, far enough from Julian's shadow, but close enough to be a sanctuary. It was a healing journey that Henry hadn't anticipated. The day they went to move Martha into the Willows was gray and somber. They found her in a cramped, drafty room at a temporary shelter. The once regal Martha Miller looked like a shattered porcelain doll. Her silver hair was disheveled, and her eyes, once so sharp, were clouded with a mixture of terror and shame. Julian had not only taken her money, he had taken her dignity. She didn't speak as Henry loaded her suitcase into the car. She sat in the back seat, staring at the floorboards, a fallen queen in a tweed coat that had seen better days. A week later, Clara told Henry she needed to go back. She needed to see Martha alone. Henry drove her to the Willows but stayed in the car, his own heart still too hardened to face the woman who had nearly destroyed his life. He watched Clara walk through the glass doors, a single bouquet of lavender in her arms, the same lavender she had grown in their Brookline garden. Clara entered Martha's room. The elderly woman was sitting in a high-backed armchair, staring out at the trees. The room was beautiful, filled with soft light and the scent of pine, but Martha looked like she was in a tomb. "Mother Miller," Clara said gently. Martha turned, her face contorted into a grimace of defense, a reflex of the old life. Have you come to gloat, Clara? Have you come to see the great Martha Miller living on your charity? Clara didn't answer. She walked to the bedside table and placed the lavender in a vase. Then she pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of her mother-in-law. For the first time, Clara didn't hide her hands under an apron or tuck them into her sleeves. She placed them openly on her lap. The sunlight from the window caught the silvery lines of the surgical scars. Martha's eyes were drawn to them. She looked at the straightened fingers, the absence of the angry red swelling that had defined Clara for 2 decades. She looked at the hands she had used as an unlikely hero uses a tool, never acknowledging the person behind the labor. Henry told me Julian tried to blame you, Clara whispered. Martha's lip trembled. He was my boy. I did everything. I took everything for him. And he called me a senile old fool as the police were putting him in the car. He told me I was useless to him now. Clara reached out. It was a slow, deliberate movement. She took Martha's wrinkled, age-spotted hands into her own. The contrast was stark. The hands of the woman who had suffered and the hands of the woman who had caused the suffering. Clara's grip was firm, a soul connection that transcended language. Martha tried to pull away, but Clara held on. Look at them, Martha, Clara said, her voice a calm, lyrical tether. These are the hands that worked the blue mist. These are the hands that Julian's debts tried to break. But they didn't break. They were repaired by the man you tried to turn against me. Martha looked down at Clara's hands, tracing the scars with her eyes. The reality of 25 years of emotion-based heartbreak finally crashed through the wall of her pride. She realized that while she had been chasing the miracle of Julian's success, she had been trampling on the actual miracle of Clara's devotion. A low, guttural sob escaped Martha's throat. It was the sound of a heart breaking, not from loss of status, but from the weight of a monumental guilt. I took your piano, Martha wailed, her head falling onto Clara's shoulder. I took your medicine. I took your house. And you brought me here to the flowers. Martha gripped Clara's hands with a desperate, claw-like intensity. For the first time in her life, she wasn't commanding. She was begging. The tears flowed down her withered cheeks, soaking into Clara's blouse. I am so sorry, Martha cried, her voice echoing in the quiet room. Oh God, Clara, I am so sorry. Forgive me. Please forgive an old woman who was too blind to see the saint in her own kitchen. Clara held her, rocking her back and forth as the sun began to set over the Rhode Island woods. The justice and redemption was complete, but it didn't look like a gavel hitting a bench. It looked like 2 women crying in a room filled with the scent of lavender. Clara had found her salvation, and in doing so, she had offered the only kind of miracle that could truly restore faith, the miracle of forgiveness. The air in Brookline had shifted from the crisp bite of autumn to a gentle, promising spring. Henry and Clara stood on the porch of their new permanent home, a modest saltbox cottage tucked away in a quiet corner of Greater Boston. Unlike the drafty Victorian in Providence, this house was filled with light. But the true miracle was the backyard, a sprawling, fragrant garden dominated by rows of purple lavender that Clara had insisted on planting the moment the frost broke. It was her healing journey, a living symbol of the peace she had finally secured. Henry looked at the brass key in his hand, then at Clara. Her face had regained a healthy glow, the hollow shadows beneath her eyes replaced by a calm, reflective brightness. He handed her the key. This isn't just a house, Clara. It's your sanctuary. Henry had returned to his roots as well. No longer burdened by the crushing debts of his brother, he had accepted a position as a music instructor at a prestigious local community center. He taught piano to children, his heart swelling every time he heard the clumsy but hopeful scales, the same scales Clara had once played so perfectly. Clara, however, found her new voice in a different medium. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she attended the Golden Age Art Studio, a sunlit loft led by a man named Arthur Sterling. Arthur was a retired architect with a shock of white hair and paint-stained spectacles, a man who believed that art was the only true way to speak when words failed. Don't paint what you see, Clara, Arthur would say, his voice a gravelly whisper. Paint what those hands remember. paint the fire, and the ice. While Henry and Clara built their new life, the echoes of the past were being reshaped by the hammer of justice. Julian, stripped of his silk shirts and his mother's protection, was serving his sentence through a rigorous community labor program in Providence. Under the watchful eye of a no-nonsense supervisor named Sergeant Briggs, a woman who saw through every excuse Julian tried to weave, the man who had never lifted a finger was forced to clean city parks and repair dilapidated community centers. Cut off from every cent of Henry's income, Julian lived in a halfway house. For the first time in 45 years, he felt the ache in his muscles that comes from a day of honest toil. He began to realize that the miracles he had always chased weren't found in Newport property deeds, but in the simple, grueling reality of being useful. He was a justice and redemption story in progress. A man finally learning the value of the labor he had once stolen from his sister-in-law. Back in Boston, Clara's studio work grew more intense. She spent hours at her easel, her surgically repaired hands moving with a tentative, soulful grace. She didn't paint the lavender or the sea. She painted memories. She painted the blue mist not as a place of labor, but as a forge where a soul was tempered. The climax of the spring season was the annual Brookline Heritage Exhibit, a local art show that drew crowds from across the city. Clara had been hesitant to enter, her silent voice still whispering that she was just a laundress. But Henry had insisted. The world needs to see what those hands have done, Clara. The community center was buzzing with life. The scent of wine and cheese mingled with the smell of fresh oil paint. Henry paced nervously near the entrance, his eyes constantly searching for Martha, who had been brought from the Willows by a nurse for the occasion. Martha sat in a wheelchair near the back, her eyes moist as she watched her daughter-in-law move through the room. The judges, led by a stern but respected critic named Beatrice Dupont, moved slowly through the aisles. Beatrice was a woman who had seen the best galleries in Europe and had little patience for the sentimental. When she reached Clara's canvas, she stopped. She stood there for a full 5 minutes, her magnifying glass hanging forgotten around her neck. The painting was titled "The Hands That Kindled the Flame." It was a stark, visceral piece. It depicted two hands, not the graceful hands of a pianist, but the raw, scarred, and weathered hands of a woman who had worked until her bones cried out. The knuckles were depicted with a gritty realism, the silvery surgical scars glowing like threads of light. Those hands were cupped together, and from within the hollow of the palms, a tiny, brilliant green sprout was emerging, bathed in a warm, golden light that seemed to pulse from the canvas. It was an emotion-based masterpiece that caused a hush to fall over the gallery. It told the story of a transformation hook, a miraculous change from pain to happiness. "This," Beatrice Dupont announced, her voice ringing out through the hall, "is the winner of the Heritage Prize. Not because of its technique, though that is formidable, but because of its truth. It is a story of a soul that refused to be extinguished." The applause was a sudden, roaring tide. Henry pushed through the crowd, his eyes blurring with tears, and caught Clara as she nearly stumbled in shock. She looked at the blue ribbon being pinned to her frame, then at her own hands. They were the hands in the painting. They were the hands that had been muck-knot ruined, but now they were the hands that had created beauty. Clara turned toward the back of the room. Her eyes met Martha's. The old woman was nodding, her lips moving in a silent "Amen," a call to faith that finally acknowledged the miracle standing before her. Clara looked at Henry, her voice a lyrical whisper that carried the weight of 25 years of survival. "I'm not just a person anymore, Henry. I'm a witness. I'm a witness to the fact that God still performs miracles, and sometimes he uses a paintbrush to do it." As the stars came out over their lavender garden that night, the unlikely hero wasn't a man with a sword, but a woman who had found her strength in the very scars that were meant to break her. The blue mist was gone, replaced by the scent of lavender and the vibrant colors of a life finally, triumphantly, her own. The Boston sun hung low in the sky, a molten orb of copper and gold that spilled across the shingled roof of the Brookline cottage. It was a late Sunday afternoon, the kind where time seems to stretch and settle, like the long shadows across the lawn. The air was no longer thick with the industrial steam of Providence or the biting salt of winter. Instead, it carried the gentle, honeyed scent of the lavender garden in full bloom. The purple stalk swayed in the breeze, a sea of calm that Clara had nurtured with her own two hands, hands that were now symbols of a healing journey. On the wide wooden porch, the Miller family had gathered. It was an assembly that would have seemed like a miracle only a year prior. Martha sat in a comfortable wicker chair, a soft wool blanket draped over her knees despite the warmth. Beside her stood Sarah, a young nursing student from the local university who worked part-time at the Willows. Sarah was a cheerful girl with a bright smile and a habit of humming soft folk tunes, providing a gentle presence that kept Martha's occasionally sharp edges softened. Martha was quiet today, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The arrogance that had once defined her had been replaced by a reflective, grounded stillness. She no longer issued commands or demanded tribute. She simply existed in the quiet grace of her daughter-in-law's forgiveness. Henry sat on the steps of the porch, his back against a railing. He looked older, perhaps, with a few more silver threads at his temples, but the deep-set lines of worry that had once etched his forehead had vanished. He was no longer a man bracing for a storm. He was a man who had finally found home. In his pocket was a letter from the Providence Labor Board, Julian's progress report. Julian was still in the city, his hands calloused from honest toil, slowly earning his way back into a world that no longer owed him a living. He wasn't here today, for he still had many miles to walk on his path of justice and redemption. But for the first time, there was hope that he might one day arrive. The screen door creaked open, a familiar, comforting sound. Clara stepped out onto the porch carrying a silver tray. She moved with a lightness that made Henry's heart swell, a transformation from the hunched, weary woman who once hid in the shadows of a laundry room. She wore a simple linen dress the color of the sky, and her hair, once tied back in a utilitarian knot, now fell in soft waves around her face. Henry watched her, his eyes tracing every movement. He remembered the blue mist, the smell of lye, and the terrifying moment she had collapsed in the steam. He remembered the cedar box and the heartbreak of discovered betrayals. But as he looked at her now, those memories felt like a story from a different life, a myth told to remind them of the dark before the dawn. Clara reached Henry and paused. With a steady, graceful motion, she set the tray on the low table. Her hands, the focus of so much pain and prayer, were no longer instruments of labor for a selfish cause. The silvery scars remained, thin lines of history written on her skin, but the swelling was gone, and the mobility was total. She was no longer a machine. She was a creator. She picked up a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. Henry noticed how her fingers curled naturally around the delicate porcelain, her grip firm yet gentle. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She wasn't serving out of a sense of enslavement or fear. She was giving out of love. "For you, Henry," she said, her voice a lyrical melody that harmonized with the rustle of the leaves. As he took the cup, their fingers brushed. Henry felt the warmth of her skin, a soul connection that transcended the decades of silence they had once endured. He looked up at her and saw her smiling, a radiant, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "The garden looks beautiful today, Clara," Henry remarked, taking a sip of the tea. "It feels like it's finally breathing," Clara replied, sitting beside him on the steps. She looked out at the lavender, then at Martha, who gave her a small, shaky nod of appreciation. The cycle of the wickedness being punished and the good being rewarded had reached its quiet conclusion. For a long time they sat in silence. It was a silence they had earned, not the heavy, suffocating silence of repressed truths, but a peaceful, reflective quiet. The only sounds were the distant chirp of a robin and the soft sigh of the wind through the elm trees. The silent voice of their love had finally found its perfect expression in this shared peace. Clara reached out and took Henry's hand in hers. She didn't hide them under an apron today. She placed her hand over his, weaving her fingers through his calloused ones. Henry looked down at their joined hands, the hands he had fought for, the hands he had saved from the blue mist and the greed of his own blood. Clara's grip tightened slightly, a gesture of profound strength. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her gaze fixed on the fading light of the Boston skyline. "Henry," she whispered. "Yes, Clara?" I sat in the studio today before you came home, she began, her voice soft but clear. I looked at the hands that kindled the flame painting, and I realized something. She lifted their joined hands into the warm light of the setting sun. The silvery scars on her knuckles caught the light, looking like threads of shimmering silk. For 25 years, I thought love was about how much I could give away, she said, her eyes moist with a deep emotional connection. I thought it was about how much of myself I could burn to keep everyone else warm. I thought the pain was the price of belonging. She turned to him, her face a portrait of the miracle that faith and love had performed. Thank you, Henry, she said, her voice breaking with a modern tenderness. Thank you for saving my hands. Not just so I could paint, and not just so I could be free of the heat, but to let me know that love is a healing journey, not a conquest. You taught me that true love is about restoration, not possession. It isn't about what we take from each other, but what we protect in each other. Henry couldn't find words. He simply pulled her closer, his heart too full for the history books he used to teach. He realized that as an unlikely hero, he hadn't just saved his wife. He had saved himself from a life of complicity. Up on the porch, Martha closed her eyes, a look of genuine peace on her face. Sarah the nurse began to hum a soft lullaby, the notes floating on the evening air. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of violet and indigo across the sky, the Millers sat in the gathering twilight. The road had been long, and the fog of Providence had been thick. But here, in the lavender-scented air of Boston, they had finally found the light. It was a timeless myth of love and loss, ending not in tragedy, but in the enduring strength of a bond that had been tested in the fire and emerged as pure as gold. The story of Henry and Clara reminds us that love is not measured by how much we can endure in silence, but by how fiercely we protect the dignity and peace of those we cherish. True sacrifice should never be a tool for exploitation, and real family is built on mutual restoration, not a one-sided taking. In our daily lives, let us remember to look at the hands of those who serve us, our spouses, our parents, our friends, and recognize the silent stories of labor written upon them. May we find the courage to speak up when we see injustice, and may we have the grace to believe that it is never too late for a miracle or a fresh start. If this story touched your heart today, please like and share it with someone who might need to hear this message of hope. Comment below with your own thoughts or experiences, and subscribe to Ki Gia Din to join our community of continuous learning and heartfelt storytelling. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the reminder that you are a God of miracles and that your love is a healing balm for the weary soul. We ask for your special blessing upon every viewer watching this today. Please touch their lives with your peace, heal the invisible wounds they may be carrying, and give them the strength to overcome any family challenge they face. May their homes be filled with the scent of lavender and the warmth of true, selfless love. If you believe that God can restore even the most broken situations and you desire his blessing upon your family, please write Amen in the comments below.